At 12:33 in the afternoon on April 28, 2025, it was a perfectly normal Monday. The sky over Spain was clear. The economy was moving. People were at their desks, in restaurants, on trains, in hospitals, and then, within a matter of seconds, not minutes, seconds, the entire electrical grid of Spain and Portugal collapsed. One of the most sophisticated, modern, interconnected power systems in Europe simply stopped working. 50 million people went dark at the same moment. Trains froze mid-route. Traffic lights across Madrid, Lisbon, Barcelona, Seville, gone. ATMs went offline. Cell towers began failing. Hospitals switched to generators. Store shelves were surrounded by people who had no way to pay for anything because every card reader in the country required electricity to function. Elevators stopped. Gas stations went silent. And in the hours that followed, as people sat in apartments that had no light, no internet, no running information, and, in some cases, no water pressure, the thing that struck observers most wasn't the darkness. It was the realization of how many things they had assumed were simply permanent features of daily life. They weren't permanent. They were borrowed. And the borrowing had always depended on one thing: the grid staying on. That event lasted about 10 hours for most of Spain. Some areas waited up to 16 hours for restoration, and when analysts reviewed what had happened to the economy, to public health, to the behavior of ordinary people, they found a common thread that runs through every major blackout in modern history. The people who struggled most were not the ones who lacked resources. They were the ones who lacked assumptions. Specifically, the ones whose assumptions had never been questioned. Because when you have never seriously imagined a world without power, when every single thing you do from the moment you wake up to the moment you fall asleep has quietly depended on a grid you never had to think about, the moment the grid fails, you discover something deeply uncomfortable. You discover how thin the margin actually is, and you discover that most of the things you assumed were guaranteed were, in fact, just conveniences held together by electricity you never had to earn. That is what this video is about. Not panic. Not doomsday thinking, not the end of civilization. This is about a very specific and very practical question. What are the things that ordinary American families take for granted every single day? Things so invisible, so automatic, so permanent feeling that they never appear on any preparedness list, that quietly stop working the moment the grid goes down. There are 11 of them, and by the time we get to number 1, the most important item on this list won't be a product. It won't be something you can buy at a hardware store. It will be something that either already exists in your household or doesn't. And if it doesn't, no amount of flashlights or canned goods will fully replace it. Let's start at 11. Number 11 is something so basic that the idea of losing it sounds almost absurd until you actually try to think through what your day would look like without it. It is the assumption that when you turn on a faucet, water comes out. Most Americans, particularly those living in cities and suburbs, have no working mental model of how water gets to their taps. It feels effortless because for most people it has always been effortless. You turn the handle, water flows. But behind that handle is an infrastructure that is far more electricity dependent than most people realize. Municipal water systems rely on a network of pump stations and elevated storage tanks to maintain pressure throughout the distribution network. Those storage tanks, the iconic water towers that dot the American landscape, operate on gravity once filled. But filling them requires electric pumps. When the power goes out, those pumps stop. The tanks begin to drain. In most systems, there is enough residual pressure to keep water flowing for several hours. But in cities where elevated storage is limited, or where the system relies primarily on ground-level tanks and continuous pumping, like Houston, Texas, the window can be much shorter. In November 2022, a transformer failure at Houston's East Water Purification Plant caused pressure across the city's distribution network to drop below 20 pounds per square inch. the state-mandated minimum threshold for safe drinking water, within 30 minutes of the outage. A boil water advisory was issued for the entire city of Houston. School districts across the metropolitan area closed. The cause was a single transformer failure, compounded by a backup transformer that also failed. 2 transformers. That is all it took to put the water supply of the 4th largest city in the United States under a health advisory. When the power fails during an extended event, a major storm, a regional grid collapse, a cascading failure, water pressure becomes one of the first casualties, and the families who had no stored water, who assumed the tap would keep working because it had always kept working, find themselves in a position that feels genuinely medieval within a matter of hours. Private well owners face this problem even more acutely. A residential well pump is entirely dependent on household electricity. The moment the power fails, the pump stops. The pressure tank in your basement holds a reserve, typically enough for a few flushes and a couple of minutes of faucet flow. And then it is gone. There is no gravity to fall back on. There is no municipal system to bridge the gap. The water is still in the ground, but you have no way to get to it. And this problem, which sounds purely mechanical, becomes intensely human very quickly when you have young children, when someone in the household has a medical need that requires hygiene, when you realize that cooking, cleaning, flushing, and hydrating all depend on a pump that has been sitting in your backyard silently for years, without ever once making you think about it. FEMA's preparedness guidance recommends storing at least 1 gallon of water per person per day, with a minimum of a 3-day supply. Most households have none, and this is the assumption that number 11 collapses. Water is not automatic. Water is infrastructure. Infrastructure requires power. Power requires a grid that can fail on an otherwise normal Monday afternoon with no warning whatsoever. Number 10 is the assumption that you can get fuel when you need it. This one surprises people because gas stations are everywhere. Drive down any commercial corridor in America, and you will pass 3 or 4 of them within a mile. The abundance of gas stations creates a deeply ingrained assumption. Fuel is available, and in ordinary life, it is. But the modern gas station is almost entirely dependent on electricity. The pumps that draw fuel from underground storage tanks require electric motors. The point-of-sale systems that process payment require internet connectivity and power. The lighting, the security cameras, the internal management systems, all of it runs on the grid. When the grid fails, the vast majority of gas stations simply stop functioning. The huge majority of gas stations in the United States do not have backup generators. Some states have moved to require them on designated evacuation routes. Florida enacted legislation after Hurricane Wilma in 2005 left most of South Florida without power and made evacuation nearly impossible when drivers could not refuel. But those requirements apply to specific locations and specific station sizes. The average suburban or rural gas station, the one on the corner you have driven past 1,000 times, almost certainly cannot pump a single gallon when the grid is down. The fuel is still there, underground, tens of thousands of gallons of it, but it is unreachable without power. During the 2019 Pacific Gas and Electric Public Safety Power shutoffs in Northern California, a series of preemptive outages that PG&E implemented to reduce wildfire risk during high wind events. Up to 900,000 customers lost power across multiple counties simultaneously. One of the most immediate and visible consequences was the collapse of fuel access. Lines formed at the handful of stations with generator power. The GasBuddy app launched a regional tracker specifically to help drivers find operational stations. People who had assumed they could refuel on the way to wherever they needed to go found themselves stranded, sometimes with tanks that were 3/4 full when the outage started, but had been burned down during hours of searching for an open station. The lesson that California learned in 2019 is one that applies everywhere. The assumption that fuel is available is, in a grid failure, almost immediately wrong. The preparation is simple, and it is not about hoarding. It is about discipline. Keeping your vehicle's tank above the halfway mark as a standing habit, particularly in seasons or regions where outages are more likely, is one of the most low-cost, high-impact preparedness decisions a household can make. Because the car with a half tank is the car that can reach the hospital, the car that can make the evacuation, the car that can get to a shelter or a family member's home 40 miles away. The car with a quarter tank may not be able to do any of those things when every gas station in the county is dark and quiet. Number 9 is the assumption that you can access your money. The United States is rapidly becoming a cashless society. According to data from the Federal Reserve's annual Diary of Consumer Payment Choice, cash accounted for just 14% of all consumer transactions in 2024. By some projections, more than half of American consumers will use no cash at all in a typical week by 2026. The convenience of this shift is real and significant, but it contains a vulnerability that almost no one thinks about until it is activated. The entire digital payment system, every card reader, every contactless tap, every mobile pay transaction, requires electricity and internet connectivity to function. ATMs require power. When the power goes out, ATMs stop working. Card readers in stores require power. When the power goes out, card readers stop working. Mobile payment apps require cell tower connectivity. When the grid fails, cell towers run on backup batteries that typically provide between 4 and 8 hours of service before going dark. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, the largest in United States history at that point, affecting 55 million people across 8 states and 2 countries. The U.S. Department of the Treasury's Financial and Banking Information Infrastructure Committee documented that ATMs throughout the affected region stopped working almost immediately. Those with backup batteries provided a brief window of functionality. Most did not. In the absence of cash, people who were hungry, thirsty, or trying to buy supplies for their families found themselves in a strange position. They had money, technically, in accounts they could not access, through systems that could not function, in a world where the only exchange that was working was physical currency handed directly from one person to another. The April 2025 Iberian blackout produced exactly this scenario. In Spain and Portugal, where cashless payments had reached adoption rates similar to the United States, people who had cash rushed to any grocery store or pharmacy still able to operate. People without cash were, in the blunt language of what actually happened, stranded. They could not buy food. They could not buy medicine. They could not purchase anything from anyone, anywhere, because the entire transactional infrastructure of modern commercial life requires the same thing the ATMs and the traffic lights and the water pumps require: electricity. The preparation here is not a return to an earlier era. It is simply a small, deliberate buffer against a specific and well-documented vulnerability. Maintaining a modest amount of physical cash, enough to cover several days of essential purchases for your household, stored securely at home, is a preparedness step that costs nothing to maintain and provides a level of access and flexibility that no amount of digital wealth can replicate when the grid is dark. Number 8 is the assumption that your medications are safe. This one carries more weight than most people want to think about. A significant portion of the American population manages chronic conditions through prescription medications, and many of those medications have storage requirements that depend entirely on refrigeration. Insulin is the most widely known example, but it is far from the only one. Certain biologic therapies, some liquid antibiotics, specific heart medications, thyroid hormones in liquid form, and a range of other critical drugs require consistent cold chain storage, typically between 36 and 46 degrees Fahrenheit, to maintain their efficacy. When the refrigerator stops, the clock starts, and the consequences of using degraded medication can range from treatment failure to serious health risk. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration's guidance states that food requiring refrigeration should be considered unsafe after 4 hours without power under typical conditions. For refrigerated medications, the agency recommends discarding them after a day or more without power, unless the drug label states otherwise. But here is the compounding problem. In a major regional outage, the pharmacies are also dark. The hospital system is running on backup power, which is typically allocated first to operating rooms, intensive care units, and emergency services, not to prescription refill operations. The distribution chain that normally delivers medications from manufacturer to wholesaler to pharmacy to patient relies on refrigerated transport, refrigerated storage at distribution centers, and electricity at every point in the chain. When the grid fails, that chain does not just slow down, it stops. During the aftermath of Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico in 2017, where the island's grid was essentially destroyed and power restoration took months in some regions, the insulin crisis received significant attention. But it was part of a broader medication access emergency that affected tens of thousands of people managing conditions that in normal life require nothing more complicated than a prescription refill. The lesson embedded in that crisis is one that applies to any household managing medication-dependent conditions. The time to think about backup storage, about medication quantity, about what happens if the pharmacy and the refrigerator and the delivery chain all fail simultaneously, is not during the emergency. It is before it. The FDA maintains guidance on medication storage during power outages. The American Red Cross recommends that households with refrigerator-dependent medications consult their healthcare provider now, before any emergency, about specific protocols for their situation. That conversation, had in advance, is worth far more than any amount of reactive improvisation when the power has already been out for 18 hours. Number 7 is the assumption that your home is maintaining a safe temperature. This one unfolds slowly enough that people underestimate it, and then quickly enough that it becomes dangerous before they realize what is happening. American homes in the 21st century are almost entirely dependent on powered climate control. In winter, furnaces require electricity to operate the ignition, the blower, and the thermostat. Even gas furnaces, which many families assume are immune to power outages, cannot function without the electrical systems that control them. In summer, air conditioning is not merely a comfort in many parts of the country. It is a survival system. The 1995 Chicago heat wave killed 739 people in the city over the course of 5 days in July. The Cook County Medical Examiner's Office attributed the deaths directly to heat-related causes, with the victims concentrated among elderly residents, people living alone, and people in upper-floor apartments in buildings without air conditioning, or with air conditioning that they could not afford to run. The atmospheric conditions that produce that crisis, temperatures above 100 degrees with heat index values well above that, combined with overnight lows that provided no relief, are conditions that modern climate science projects will become more frequent, not less. And in those conditions, a home without functional air conditioning is not uncomfortable. It is dangerous, particularly for the elderly, for infants, for people with cardiovascular conditions, and for people with respiratory illness. In the other direction, the 2021 winter storm Uri produced temperatures across Texas that dropped to single digits in areas that had not experienced temperatures that low in decades. The grid failure that occurred during Uri left millions of Texas homes without heat for days. People ran cars in garages to stay warm and died of carbon monoxide poisoning. They burned furniture. They huddled in interior rooms. The state medical examiner's office eventually attributed 246 deaths directly to the storm and its effects, with cold exposure and hypothermia among the leading causes. These were not people who lacked common sense. They were people whose entire understanding of winter was built on the assumption that heating would work. When it didn't, they had no plan because they had never imagined needing one. The preparation does not require a whole home generator. It requires an honest conversation about what your household will do in the first 12 hours if your climate control fails in summer or winter. It requires knowing which rooms retain heat best, which windows face south, what your household's tolerance for temperature change is, and what the thresholds are for the most vulnerable people in your home. That conversation, held in advance, changes everything about how the first hours of a temperature emergency unfold. Number 6 is the assumption that communication is available. Modern American households communicate almost entirely through infrastructure. Text messages, phone calls, emails, video calls, all of it routes through cell towers, fiber lines, data centers, and routers, every single component of which requires continuous power. Cell towers in the United States are required by FCC regulations to have backup power, typically battery backup capable of providing 4 to 8 hours of operation, with some towers also carrying generators. But in a major grid event, those backup systems are finite. Battery reserves drain, generator fuel runs out, and as towers fail, the ones that remain operational become overwhelmed by the volume of people trying to use them simultaneously, producing the busy signals and dropped calls and failed text messages that have characterized every major domestic power emergency in recent memory. During the 2012 blackout caused by Hurricane Sandy across the northeastern United States, the Federal Communications Commission reported that approximately 25% of cell towers in the 10 most affected states lost service. In the hardest hit areas, parts of New Jersey and New York, the figure was significantly higher. People who needed to reach family members, check on elderly relatives, or communicate with emergency services found themselves in a communication blackout layered on top of a power blackout. The assumption that you can always reach someone, that help is always a call away, that your family can always find each other. All of it depends on towers that have a battery life and generators that have a fuel supply, battery-powered and hand-crank emergency radios, the kind certified by NOAA for weather emergency broadcasting, address one specific and critical slice of this problem. They allow a household to receive information from official emergency broadcasts without depending on the internet, cellular networks, or powered speakers. Knowing what is happening, where the outage extends, how long restoration is expected to take, whether water is safe. That information is available through emergency radio broadcasts even when every other communication system has failed. It is not a replacement for full communication, but it is the difference between being isolated and being informed. Number 5 is the assumption that your food is safe. Not the food on your pantry shelf, the food in your refrigerator and your freezer. The average American household carries several $100s worth of food in cold storage at any given time. According to U.S. Census Bureau data published in 2024, approximately 14% of households that experienced a power outage reported that food spoiled as a result. That figure represents roughly 4.9 million housing units across the country, and it understates the problem because it counts only households that reported spoilage, not households that discarded food out of uncertainty, or households that consumed food that should have been discarded. The USDA's guidance is unambiguous. Refrigerated food should be considered unsafe after 4 hours at temperatures above 40 degrees Fahrenheit. A full freezer will hold safe temperatures for approximately 48 hours. A half-full freezer for roughly 24 hours. But here is where the assumption collapses. Most people have no way of knowing what temperature their refrigerator interior has actually reached, because the thermometer that would tell them that is a piece of equipment almost no one owns. The digital display on the front of the refrigerator goes dark when the power goes out. The interior temperature is invisible, and the decision, is this chicken safe to cook? Or has it been sitting in the danger zone for the last 6 hours? Gets made on intuition rather than information, which is exactly the wrong basis for a food safety decision. A refrigerator thermometer, a simple, inexpensive, analog device that costs under $10 and requires no power to function, is one of the most asymmetrically valuable preparedness purchases a household can make. It converts the most consequential food safety question of a power outage from a guess into a fact. That fact, in the first hours of a grid failure, determines whether your family eats safely or risks a foodborne illness in a moment when medical access may itself be compromised. The $5 thermometer in the refrigerator is not a survival item in the dramatic sense. It is the item that allows every other food decision to be made correctly, instead of hopefully. Number 4 is the assumption that light is available when you want it. This one sounds too simple to include until you sit in real darkness. Not the comfortable near darkness of a bedroom with the curtains drawn, but the complete, disorienting darkness of a home with no interior light source at 2 in the morning. Urban and suburban American households have almost no relationship with genuine darkness. Streetlights, neighbor windows, ambient glow from commercial areas. Even without interior lights, there is almost always some residual light reaching most American homes. In a widespread grid failure, that ambient light disappears too. The streetlights go dark. The commercial corridors go dark. And what remains is a level of darkness that is genuinely disorienting for people who have never experienced it as adults. The NFPA, the National Fire Protection Association, has documented a consistent pattern across major blackout events in the United States. Candle-related fires spike dramatically in the hours and days following a power outage. People reach for candles because candles are what they have. They place them on surfaces that are not designed for open flame. They fall asleep with them burning. They knock them over in the dark. During the 2003 Northeast blackout, the New York City Fire Department responded to a significant increase in candle-related fires in the days following the event. The CPSC, the Consumer Product Safety Commission, has noted that home candle fires cause an estimated 7,400 fires per year in normal conditions, and that this number increases measurably in the aftermath of power outages. The candle is not the problem. The problem is the candle used by someone who has no alternative light source and is trying to navigate their home in genuine darkness for the first time. A layered light system, LED flashlights with known fresh batteries in multiple rooms, battery-powered lanterns for common areas, headlamps for hands-free mobility, costs less than $50 to build for an average household and transforms the darkness problem from a safety hazard into a manageable inconvenience. The flashlight that is discovered in a kitchen drawer with dead batteries during the first hour of an outage is not a preparedness item. It is a reminder that preparedness did not happen. Number 3 is the assumption that help is coming. This is the assumption that lives deepest in the American relationship with emergency infrastructure, and it is the one most dramatically challenged by the historical record. The assumption is reasonable in its origins. There are fire departments and police departments and emergency medical services and power company crews and FEMA and the National Guard. In a real emergency, the machinery of response exists and it is substantial. But that machinery operates at scale, and scale has limits. When Hurricane Florence made landfall in North Carolina in September 2018, the storm moved with unusual slowness over the region, producing catastrophic inland flooding across an area spanning dozens of counties. In some communities along the Cape Fear River and the Neuse River, flooding cut off roads entirely for days. Emergency responders could not physically reach people who were calling for help. Not because the responders were absent or indifferent, they were not, but because the geography of the disaster exceeded the physical capacity of the response in those early days. Residents who had prepared, who had supplies and a plan and the means to shelter in place safely, endured the waiting period with difficulty, but without catastrophe. Residents who had assumed help would arrive in hours, and who had made no preparation for the possibility that it might not, faced a very different experience. FEMA's preparedness guidance recommends that every household have the capacity to sustain itself independently for at least 72 hours following a major emergency. That recommendation exists not because FEMA expects to be unavailable, but because FEMA knows from decades of disaster response that the first 72 hours of a major event are precisely when response resources are most constrained. Power restoration crews are being mobilized and staged. Road damage is being assessed. The full picture of what happened and where help is most urgently needed is still being assembled. During that window, the household that can manage its own water, food, light, warmth, and communication is the household that allows emergency resources to be directed toward the people who truly cannot manage on their own, toward the hospital patients, the people with no mobility, The communities without any margin at all. Self-sufficiency in the first 3 days is not selfishness. It is the decision that allows the system to function for everyone. Number 2 is the assumption that your pantry is ready. This is the item that almost every emergency preparedness organization in the United States lists first, and almost every American household fails to actually build. FEMA recommends a minimum of a 72-hour supply of food and water for every person in a household, with a 2-week supply as the more resilient standard for extended events. The American Red Cross echoes this. The CDC has published preparedness guidance that includes shelf-stable food as a foundational element. And yet, when surveys and census data examine actual household preparedness levels, the gap between the recommendation and the reality is enormous. The reason is psychological as much as logistical. Shelf-stable food preparedness requires you to think about a future you hope will not happen, spend money on things you hope never to use, and find space for items that contribute nothing visible to daily life. It requires what behavioral economists call pre-commitment, a deliberate act of setting resources aside for a future self who will be in a different situation than your present self can easily imagine. This is genuinely hard. It runs against the grain of how humans naturally allocate attention and resources. But it is also, in the historical record of every major extended outage in the United States, one of the most consequential differences between households that manage a grid failure with difficulty and households that manage it with real danger. Shelf-stable food preparedness is not about stockpiling. It is about rotation. The principle is simple. Buy slightly more than you currently use of the foods your household already eats. Canned goods, dried beans, peanut butter, crackers, oats, rice, pasta, and date what you buy. Use the oldest items first. Replace them when you use them. Over time, without a single dramatic purchase, you build a pantry reserve that functions automatically because it is part of how the household already operates. A family that eats rice twice a week and keeps a 10-pound bag in rotation is a family that has food during a week-long outage. A family that buys exactly what it needs each week and has nothing extra is a family that is one grid failure away from the exact situation that plays out in every disaster photograph. Empty shelves, long lines, and the particular anxiety of not knowing what you will eat tomorrow. The pantry also addresses something that preparedness lists often undervalue: the emotional dimension of crisis. Food is not merely calories. During a power outage, when the routine of daily life has been disrupted, when there is stress and uncertainty and the particular fatigue of not knowing when things will return to normal, a familiar meal, made from ingredients that are simply there, is a source of stability and comfort that no emergency ration bar can fully replace. The household that can make pasta, or soup, or oatmeal from its own pantry, without a trip to the store, without a card reader, without a refrigerator. That household is managing the psychological dimension of a grid failure as effectively as the physical one. And both dimensions matter, far more than most preparedness conversations acknowledge. Number 1 is the assumption that your household already knows what to do. This is the one no one writes on a shopping list. It cannot be ordered online and delivered to your door. There is no version of it available at the hardware store or the camping supply section of any retailer. And it is, across the full body of disaster research accumulated by institutions like the University of Delaware's Disaster Research Center, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, and the American Red Cross. The single most consequential factor in how a household actually performs when a grid failure happens. Not the flashlights, not the water jugs, not the generator, the plan. A household emergency plan is not complicated. It is a documented set of answers to the questions that a grid failure will force your family to confront, written down before the emergency, agreed upon before the emergency, understood by every person in the household before the emergency. Where will the family go if the home becomes unsafe? Who is the out-of-state contact that everyone will check in with, since local calls are often overwhelmed when regional networks are congested? Where are the medications kept? And what is the protocol if refrigerated medications lose cold storage? What are the temperature thresholds for heat in summer, for cold in winter, at which the family will leave the home and go to a public shelter? Who is responsible for the water? Who is responsible for the flashlights? Who is responsible for the radio? What does the family do in the first hour? What does it do in the first night? These questions have answers. Good answers. But the answers have to be worked out in advance, because the moment the power goes out is exactly the wrong moment to begin the conversation. In the dark, under stress, with children asking questions and phones losing charge and the temperature beginning to shift, the cognitive load of a grid failure is significant. The household that has already had the conversation, that has a printed plan in a physical location that every family member knows, is operating at a fundamental advantage over every household that is having that conversation for the first time, while the emergency is already in progress. The printed plan matters specifically because it is printed. A plan that exists only in a phone is a plan that may become inaccessible the moment the phone's battery dies, and there is no power to charge it. A plan written on paper, stored in a location that every member of the household knows, survives every grid failure that has ever happened, and every one that will happen in the future. It costs nothing. It requires an afternoon, once, and then a brief review once a year to update for any changes in the household situation. And it is the one item on this list that no amount of subsequent purchasing can replace. The historian of preparedness is not an alarmist, the preparedness researcher at FEMA, the disaster sociologist at the University of Delaware, the emergency manager who has worked through 40 major events. None of them believe the grid will fail tomorrow, or that the American way of life is one outage away from collapse. What they believe, uniformly across decades of research and field experience, is something much simpler. They believe that the gap between managed difficulty and genuine danger in a power emergency is almost always explained by one variable: whether a household made a small number of specific low-cost decisions before the emergency happened. Stored water, a cash reserve, medications accounted for, a fuel strategy, a light system that does not depend on candles, a pantry with a 3-day margin, a radio that works without the internet, and a plan. A real, written, agreed-upon, physically located plan that every member of the household knows exists and knows how to use. The grid in Spain and Portugal came back. It almost always comes back. The question that the April 28th blackout asked, and that every major outage in American history has asked, is not whether life will return to normal. It will. The question is what the hours and days before normal returns look like for your family, and the answer to that question was shaped, in almost every case, by decisions that were made, or not made, long before the lights went out. The next question this naturally raises is one we have been circling for several episodes now. If the pantry is where the difference gets made in those critical days, then what exactly belongs in a prepared pantry? And what items give people a false sense of security because they seem like good choices, but fail in ways most people don't anticipate until they actually try to use them in the middle of a grid failure? That question has a specific, sourced, and somewhat surprising answer, and it is the subject of the next video in this series.